What's up everybody, Jhow here, and in this video we're going to do something slightly different. Today I'm going to talk about Diablo. I'm going to give my opinion as well as some insights that I've kind of discovered over the last few years, whether it's being around esports or just gaming in general, as well as a few other things I might be able to share with you guys. So let's talk about the future of Diablo. So let's briefly talk about what you already know. Blizzard has stated that there are multiple Diablo projects. We all know that. And there's been a lot of speculation about what this means. Is it the Diablo 2 rework? Is it multiple other titles? Is it a Diablo 4? There's rampant speculation with little to no knowledge as far as what's going on out there. The one good thing is the plural part of it still remains intact even after the Diablo Immortals announcement. And now that we've hit the Immortals announcement, it means that there's only one direction that Blizzard can go into. That is the biggest one, and that's the Battle Royale. Nah, I'm just kidding. All right, let's talk about where Diablo's been and where it could potentially be going, because that kind of sets the tone for what we might be looking for with our next Diablo titles coming at us. Okay, one thing that we can agree on is that Diablo 3, it scratched that Diablo itch. It was after Diablo 2 and then Lord of Destruction, which came out in the very early 2000s, that we were waiting. We wanted that new updated Diablo. We waited over a decade, and we finally got it. We got it through the good and the bad. I remember when I first played the Diablo 3 beta, it felt familiar. It felt normal. It felt exactly what we were waiting for. You know, the graphics had come a long way, the fluidity was there, and it was just vast improvements over a game that we had Diablo, then we saw Diablo 2 kind of break the game and put it in a whole new light, and then Diablo 3 just kind of took it another step further. But are there more steps beyond that? You know, we're now at about 6 years past Diablo 3's original release date, and it's still being played by a large population. Let's be honest, most people, they come back every time there's a new season announced. Some stay, some go, some come back every time. Some come back after a couple of years, trust me, I know. And then after a rough early start, when it was the auction house, the fateful auction house, the crazy game modes in the beginning, and everything along the way, the bumps and bruises, it seems like Diablo started to right the ship, and then when Reaper of Souls came out, seemed to set sail on a journey that has basically saved the good name of the Diablo franchise and is why we're continuing to look forward towards the next Diablo title. When we look towards the future of Diablo, I think it's very clear to me that Diablo has to have very different projects. It feels like if you were to try and go into something like a Dark Souls or a Skyrim style of game and then also do another isometric, just straight up Diablo 4, it seems like you're kind of not necessarily overlapping, but you're basically appealing to the same general audience. And there's not really that style where we're going to get two of the same. So I think instead, when we look at this, we have to start looking at the broad spectrum of the gaming genres to figure out how one can be on one side, still bring in a crowd, but also be on the other side and be somewhat different without that maybe kind of overlapping. You want people to enjoy both games, but you also want to have longevity for each individual one. If one is simply better than the other and they're kind of similar but mostly different, it seems like one would just cannibalize the other. So the first genre that stands out to me that Blizzard has done almost that nobody else has done is the RTS genre. And Diablo is the only really big early franchise that didn't get an RTS. We had Warcraft, we had StarCraft, which started out respectively as what they were, and then they've become something totally different. Warcraft became World of Warcraft. StarCraft has just continued to live on through its games and the esports scene in general, and Diablo has just kind of casually watched from the outside, but the longevity of Diablo is now pushing 20 to 25 plus years of what we're looking at for Diablo, and that 20 plus years that we've got of Diablo, it almost feels like it's time that we start looking outside of the realm of let's stay here. Now, we know that a very prominent former StarCraft person on staff moved over to a Diablo project almost 2 years ago. A lot of this has been very well documented by our very, very good friend Riker, who also covers a lot of Diablo content, so we're not going to get too in-depth into that. The one thing about the RTS side is that it feels like because it's an outlier and it's on one end of the spectrum, almost in its own world, it means that you can go whatever direction you want with another game, and you're still hitting a very general audience with the RTS crowd, which you can't really disappoint the mainstream crowd so long as you're bringing in another game with it. If you just come out with RTS and say, this is what we've got, it will probably disappoint many people. But it still leaves the door open for the fact that you now have the RTS side and you could potentially have any other type of game because we are looking at multiple projects. And I think also when we talk about RTS, it leaves open the door for a potential esports scene. And as someone who's been around Blizzard over the last 3 years, particularly focusing on esports, it's clear that esports is the way of the future. You can also look outside of Blizzard and see that basically every game that's coming out, some competitive mode exists for esports. And it could be a major game strictly dedicated to esports, or we look at something where who would have thought all this time that Clash Royale would come out from Clash of Clans and we would have an esports scene, and now Supercell comes out with even more, and we're looking at esports based off of simple mobile titles, which I know is a very touchy subject. So with that being said, it's clear that at least one of the multiple projects that you have has to have some type of competitive environment or the ability to have an esports side of things to make it work. Esports brings in marketing, basically free marketing that you can't really get. Yes, you're investing into your own game through that esports scene, and by way of that visibility, you get the players. But it also brings in just an unrivaled amount of attention towards your game that can help the longevity of it. I mean, Warcraft has gone on all of this time and created superstars. Same for StarCraft. We know the RTS genre is big. Maybe not in the American scene it's as big, but then you start to go overseas towards Korea and the other areas like China, and all of a sudden you're looking at, okay, we have a potential much larger market that still appeals to basically everyone in the gaming community. And speaking of the RTS genre, just recently at BlizzCon, Warcraft Reforged was announced, breathing life back into the RTS genre. Also, StarCraft has been around for so long, it seems like it could potentially go on forever again, thanks to the Korean scene. So the RTS genre is one that just immediately stands out to me when I think about potential titles, things that we already know, and the ability to branch out in one direction without that crazy feedback like we saw for Immortals, and without letting certain people down. So I've gone on at length about the RTS. So if we consider RTS to be a viable option, we're not saying it's guaranteed, but if we consider it to be a viable option, then what are the other options that we have that could potentially be the second game, or they could be wildly different to they could just be altogether different titles of the first and second of their own. Let's be honest, another top-down isometric Diablo game we would probably play. But is that really what we want? Diablo is barely 6 years old, or going on 6 years old here in 2019. And it seems like if we were just to do it all over again with better graphics and everything else, it seems like we would be entering the same old, same old. The game is still somewhat popular. We just had a basically limited expansion with the Necromancer a couple of years ago. The popularity of the game is still there, as I mentioned, with all the seasons, so it almost seems inconceivable that we're going right back down, which also makes me question whether we're actually getting an official Diablo 4 as opposed to just other Diablo titles. If you did want to go directly into that same style of Diablo 4 that is a direct connection to Diablo 3, and it's a top-down isometric or a top-down anything game that remotely resembles Diablo 1, 2, and 3, it seems like it would have to be supplanted by another Diablo title soon in the next year or two, and then let Diablo 3 wither away, and then come in with a Diablo 4 similarly with a few years down the road. That timeline doesn't really match up with what we think that we could get if it were a direct connection similar to Diablo 1, 2, and 3. One thing that particularly interests me is what we've seen from games like Skyrim, who the replayability of these games has gone on for quite some time. We've seen Red Dead Redemption just come back recently, and these games captured storylines. They captured infinite gameplay for what seemed like eternity and eons for certain people that played that game. If you were to couple that with an RTS style game, does that necessarily capture the longevity of the game? If you really wanted to dive into the Diablo franchise, you could say, we'll go into the storytelling type game now, an RTS game along with it, and then down the road look towards that Diablo 4. Even if you aren't going into that direct Diablo 4 similar style play, a storytelling game does seem like it could still captivate the same general audience that we know from Diablo players. Maybe if we don't go into the RTS style, then clearly the Skyrim, Red Dead Redemption style games could easily be a Plan A concept, the same way that an RTS could be, or seemingly could just be both Plan A, A1, and A2. And just to briefly touch on it, we know that WoW, for as long as it's gone on, it's been great, but no MMO can do what it could possibly ever do, and we're not even sure how long that will last. As great as an MMO sounds for Diablo, I got a feeling that that's probably not going to be the option. Before we dive any deeper into what some other game types would be like, let's also keep in mind of what the potential gaming landscape is right now in our current environment. Given that right around the time Diablo 3 came out was around the same time that other developers started to look into the pay model for in-game skins, goodies, loot boxes, things like that. They started to come in around that time, and they've been around, don't get me wrong, but they started to get really popularized just a few years ago and shortly after that. And we know how Diablo's auction house came out. And to say that they missed the mark would be an understatement. I'm sure they made money. I'm sure that the numbers looked good. But that was such a huge obstacle for them to overcome. They managed to do that. But let's just say that it's highly unlikely we won't be going down that route again. But the in-game purchase model is going to have to be available in some form or fashion in whatever game comes next. If we look at a regular Diablo title for what we've known it to be between Diablo 1, 2, and 3, then the next title, it doesn't necessarily fit that model. Yes, there are certain things that you could conceivably buy now, but we're talking about a broad spectrum of what appeals to the masses and can also not eliminate your current player base by just tilting them off the face of the earth by throwing in a pay model in terms of cosmetics and things like that. With that being said, let's go back to looking at some of the other genres that have been really popular. We know that Blizzard, they've been able to innovate in the past. With Warcraft, with StarCraft, with Diablo, we know that they've had a unique approach since the beginning. World of Warcraft, they took ideas and they just made it simply better. But now we're in a current generation to where we know what's established. We know what's worked. We got Overwatch, a first-person shooter with some different style on it. We're not getting another FPS. We're definitely not getting the Diablo FPS. That's just not a thing. But now we have to start looking at what models currently exist and what could Diablo potentially make better. Well, for one, there's the fighting game community, and you gotta ask yourself, this is nothing that Blizzard has ever done. Would they be willing to go into something like a Street Fighter? It seems really unlikely. As popular as that genre can be amongst that community, it doesn't seem like Blizzard would say, hey, we've got Diablo, let's make a fighting game, without including, say, other titles like StarCraft and Warcraft. So that one is one of the highly unlikely ones. Another title that kind of springs up from time to time is those survival games. That kind of limits your age group to 18 and older, which generally Diablo technically should be. But then we look at those survival games. I mean, it would be cool to be running from Diablo and other terrors that come from Sanctuary, but survival games have never had that longevity. They're more flashes in the pan. People enjoy them and they go. I don't see that being an option either. So let's go back to the major titles that we might be able to expect. I half joked about the Battle Royale. Again, same category as fighting game categories, that it seems unlikely that that would just be a Diablo thing. But now let's look back to where we were before, the storytelling side of things. If we're getting away from the simple top-down and we're branching out, then we have to look back at the Skyrim, the Red Dead Redemption, the whole storytelling role. It allows you to basically stay within Sanctuary's realm. You can get pretty graphic with what you want to bring to the table. There are really no limits to what type of creativity you have in those games. We saw with Red Dead Redemption, they made so many major things happen with a game that we're like, wait a minute, can this live up to the hype? And it did. Skyrim, we know Skyrim has been around. The Elder Scrolls have been around for so long, but Skyrim changed the open world, and people are still playing and modding that to this day. If Blizzard wants to go in that route, we saw what mods could do for World of Warcraft, but it seems like they've kind of shut that door in terms of allowing third-party mods in. if you start to look at does that storytelling work, then yeah, the stories can be pretty dark. You can do whatever you want, and it can capture an entire player base without disappointing somebody, saying from the normal Diablo realm and saying, we're not getting the same type of dark, sinister Diablo that we're used to in Sanctuary. Because with that style of game, you can definitely hit the nail on the head. As much as I hate to say this, we also have to consider the fact that there could be more potential mobile games coming out. I've heard rumblings of other Blizzard IPs that could potentially be coming, or older IPs that could be making their way onto mobile. And let's make no mistake about it, mobile has been a trending thing for the last 5 to 7 years, just due to the evolution of what we've got on phones, because you've all got them, don't you? But let's be honest, Diablo's audience is not necessarily the mobile one. That's pretty obvious at this point. But we all still have phones, we all still play games on there. But in terms of what you want out of a Diablo title is the one thing that you're probably not going to get or give on a mobile title. We all know that the mobile generation, for what it's worth, is basically around the younger generation. And Diablo's never been about the younger generation. Yes, some of us are old enough to have played Diablo 2, to have played Diablo early in our young years when we were kids. But look at the generation now of gamings. They're quick, they're fast, there's a lot of turnover, and very few tend to stay there. And as much as I think that model is something that we'll have to embrace as time goes on, I don't necessarily see Diablo going directly down that route for one of the big announcements. Now, I wouldn't count this category out completely, but I would say that I don't know if Diablo has the credibility right now to go that wildly different with a game to make that work. Now, I've touched on some possibilities of what I think could be there for Diablo. That fits within the realm of Blizzard, that fits within the realm of Diablo and Sanctuary, and what could potentially come out. Look, we've all speculated, we've all had these opinions. I've heard some things along the way. These are certain things that maybe could happen, maybe not. I have no real direct info, but sometimes you just have to speculate, and that's half the fun until we get the official announcements. But let's keep in mind that if we're going down the Diablo realm, we have Diablo 1, 2, and 3. If we're simply waiting for Diablo 4, then what do we actually expect out of Diablo 4? If the next Diablo title is simply the same, I think the disappointment's going to be there. Yes, you're going to get that storyline. But however, if we switch gears and go towards one of these different titles, then it seems like we can still get the exact same storytelling that we want out of Diablo, that we want out of Sanctuary, but it starts to maybe look at it in a different light. And I think one of those things that I'm going to maybe make the analogy of is that I think we have to look at it this way, is that Star Wars, we all wanted Star Wars to come back for so long, and we wanted it done right. We wanted the episodes back, we wanted the story to continue, and we started to get the episodes. But then we also got the sidebars. We got Rogue One, we got Solo, Han Solo Star Wars story, something like that. And while they are Star Wars stories, they're kind of out there on their own. They exist within the realm, they tell a story on the side, and they somehow try and directly connect themselves to the story at hand. And I feel like whatever we get is going to feel pretty similar to that type of scenario, to where it's, okay, well, we've got the main story. We've got the main trending of these games. Hey, we've got our own trilogy right now with Diablo 1, 2, and 3. But what if we tied some of these stories together? That's kind of where Immortals is. Immortals might actually be our solo, a Star Wars story. The only problem is we're judging it before it ever comes out. Look, I know the story, I know the lore, I know who dies and who goes and who stays and the important character names. But when I load up Diablo, I'm here to hack and slash. It's what I want. It's the infinite quest for gear. The story dies after you finish it. You can play through it again, but most of us don't play through Diablo for the story. So Diablo Immortals, I can understand why it doesn't necessarily feel the same, because it's basically the exact same thing, except it's on mobile, and the delivery was terrible. Now, let's look at this through another lens. If Diablo Immortal was simply just another add-on or a short-term expansion for Diablo 3, and that was one of the major announcements, would we have felt okay about that? I think that when we look at the reaction that we had towards Diablo Immortals, we now look at the fact that we didn't necessarily like it because it's the same thing, but it's on mobile. If you take it off mobile and put it on PC, it's the same thing. The outrage might not have been the same, but I feel the letdown still would have been there. Look, for now, Diablo Immortals, it's going to try and quench that thirst. Hit the appetite of, look, we want more current style Diablo. Unfortunately, it came in the way that it did, and I think a lot of us were justifiably upset about it. I, for one, I'm probably still going to play it. I'm a lifelong Diablo guy. How much I'll play it, I don't know. And while it's certainly not everyone's cup of tea, it's definitely going to hit a large market, whether it's the Chinese market, whether it's the rest of the world market. It's going to hit a market and it's going to make money. Look, it was licensed out, created by Blizzard China. Whatever it was, the details are out there. Look, Blizzard is just bringing that on. It's their way to say, look, we're doing this. And maybe that's part of the outcry, is the way that they're using that title to just try and make money. But it's a business, and I'm going to respect that fact and look beyond it and look towards the next games that are coming out. And I think it's also going to provide an important measure, because despite what we say about it, there's still going to be a lot of people that are going to play it. And it gives Blizzard their first chance to really put a title out on the mobile device, on your phone, and really try and say, look, we're going to test it out. Look, everybody knows this is the way it's going to work. But it's going to give them some key data in terms of how they want to move forward. If they already have mobile titles in development, then they're likely going to keep going with those. But it's our way to say, hey, look, we're going to test it out. And I think that's fine. Yes, Diablo has done an incredible job on the Nintendo Switch. But the Switch, I don't own a Switch. I do own a phone. And I think that that's the parallel that they're trying to make, is that whether you have a Switch or not, everybody can't play it. Everybody has a phone. That's the meme. That's the joke. I'm going to let it be. So I'm curious, what do you think the next Diablo title is going to be? Is it Diablo 4? Would you like another mobile game? Would you be okay if they said one of our next projects is the mobile game? Are you expecting bigger and better things from Diablo? Do you want the Skyrim style? Do you want an RTS style? What is it that you want from that? Are you okay with another top-down isometric game? Look, everything that we want, we know that we're going to get, but there's going to be some fluff with it. The new gaming culture that we're in, it requires a lot more. You have to have in-game stuff. You have to have purchasable things, and you have to have a new model to make games, because that's just the way it is. The exclusivity of a lot of things seems to have changed everything, and, well, looks like we're along for the ride. Our opinions will be heard, and some will have an impact, but overall, I'm curious what you guys' thoughts are about this whole situation and what you think might be coming. Special shout out to my patrons on Patreon for their support, allowing me to continue to make YouTube videos and be involved in the gaming community. Thank you so much. See you next time.